It's November the 11th, 2021, and I saw Dune last night. It was exactly what I expected. Now, I'm not a professional movie critic, nor am I particularly knowledgeable, but I am still arrogant enough to put my opinions out here as though it matters. Still, I have to stress that my credentials are exactly nil, so if you disagree, if you like this film, that's swell. I'm happy for you. I am not trying to convince you that you're wrong. Mostly, this is just me explaining why it didn't work for me personally. And if that's the kind of thing that's useful or entertaining to anyone else, cool. If not, well, thank you for watching. Fair warning, I am not going to worry about spoilers for a book that came out 55 years ago and has been filmed twice. So if you don't already know what happens, that's on you, okay? In fact, I'm not even sure I need to give a synopsis, but I guess I will. More than 10,000 years from now, the galaxy is a feudal society that is run by a bunch of noble houses who answer to an emperor. These noble houses, which all run one or more planets, are continually jockeying with each other for various advantages, and occasionally even fight actual wars with each other. That said, their society is stable and has been for thousands upon thousands of years. Oh, and there are no aliens. This is a strictly humans-only universe, which I find refreshing. Aliens are such a cliche most of the time. Anyway, the entire galaxy runs on a substance called melange, which can only be found on one planet and can't be produced elsewhere. Industry, medicine, transportation, all depend on melange, and without it, civilization ends, effectively. The planet itself is a vicious, barely habitable, worldwide desert, which is also home to a group called the Fremen, who have been subjugated by this group or that group of outsiders ever since it was discovered that their god-awful hellhole of a planet had something of value on it. This is, and has always been, a pretty obvious allegory for how important oil is in the modern world, which, when the book was written, was mostly concentrated in the worst parts of the Middle East. The world runs on oil directly or indirectly. The people who live in those lands were pretty weak and easily subjugated, and their resources were taken to keep the world running. If, however, the natives were to get organized and rise up and seize control of their own lands, then they could effectively rule the world, right? So, in the end, Dune is a fairly obvious spin on the Lawrence of Arabia story, though with a happier ending. Assuming you don't read the sequels, anyway. I am just spelling this out because a surprising number of people younger than me, who didn't live through the gas crises of the 1970s, assume that Herbert created this entire world out of whole cloth, rather than it basically being the 1960s fuel-based economy in space! It's worth noting because in 1965, OPEC hadn't really flexed its muscles yet, and there was a lot of fear over what might happen if and when they did. The book is an extremely metaphorical exploration on that, but of course that's not all that it is. I don't want to sound reductive here. Were it just about that, nobody would remember it. That's just the starting point of the story, and not the whole story. Anyway, when the movie starts, the Harkonnen family has been in charge of the planet Arrakis, and hence all the melange production, for about 80 years. Meanwhile, the Atreides family has grown popular enough to be a source of annoyance for the Emperor. So he pulls the Harkonnens from Dune and gives it to the Atreides, presumably as a reward for loyal service or some nonsense like that. But the Atreides are not fools, and they know that it's a trap. Alas, they are fools enough to just blunder in anyway, and after some adventures that establish how this world works and how dangerous it is, the Emperor springs the trap. The Harkonnens attack, supported secretly by the Emperor's personal guard, and they completely wipe out the Atreides, excepting for the heir to the throne, Paul, and his mother, Jessica. They escape into the desert, where they are found and taken in by a bunch of Fremen. The end. At least that's the end of the movie. The book goes on for another 600 pages or so. So, is it a good movie? It's okay. It's not great, it's not awful, it is pretty much exactly what I expected based on the commercials. It's weird, I watched those ads on TV for almost 2 years now and none of them moved me. Finally the movie opened and people raved about it and I said, well, the commercials look rather lifeless and bland. And they said, well, you gotta see it on the big screen to fully appreciate it. And I thought, well, that's fair. There's a lot of movies that I saw on TV for the first time that were way the frack better when I saw them in re-releases years later. Blade Runner, The Road Warrior. Yes, I'm old, but there are more recent examples as well. But I am not going to list them because I am old. So anyway, I got out of the house and I hied myself to the local Cineplex, where I was one of 2 people in the entire theater, and I watched the film, and it still did nothing for me. I felt nothing. It's not that it was a bad film. And there were a few bits that I liked, such as Paul freaking out in the tent in the desert, or how they handled the voice, or the fact that this movie managed to make ornithopters seem plausible rather than goofy. But taken as a movie as a whole, yeah, it just did nothing for me. I didn't hate it. I didn't resent my time spent, but it's just bland. Part of that is its overindulgent length. Everything we see here could easily have been done in 90 minutes with standard movie pacing. But the director's style is to let each scene play out a few beats longer than anyone else would, and that adds up. I don't hate this, but there's too much. There's not a bad performance here, but with the exception of Jason Momoa, who can't help being Jason Momoa, everyone has a fairly flat affect and pretty much the same energy level. And when somebody does break out of this affect, it is extremely effective by contrast. But on the other hand, no one really breaks from it much, which means that apart from Paul, who's in nearly every scene, and Jason Momoa, who is one of the leading causes of Jason Momoa-ness in film today, nobody really stands out. And as much as I love seeing Jason Momoa go all Ronin Dex on a bunch of Imperial Sardaukar, he's not in much of the movie, and he dies. Apart from him, we don't really feel for these people. They're ciphers, not characters. They're props to be moved around as the script dictates, not people we care for. I do think the guys who played Thufir and Dr. Yui get a lot out of what little they're asked to do, but everybody else is just too restrained. Also, much has been made of the sweeping grandeur and scope of the cinematography, but again, it did nothing for me. The modern style is to not set the white balances on films these days, which results in less contrast and a more muted color palette, and just generally less visual pop. People like it, I don't. My wanting more accurate coloring is based on my years as a cameraman having that driven into my head, and I personally can't get past it. If someone gets bored and decides to color correct some scenes just as an experiment, then I really do think it would be gorgeous. But as it is, it does nothing for me. And then there's the score by Hans Zimmer. Much like the movie itself, I should love Hans Zimmer. He's a really nice guy, he actually genuinely cares about music, he enjoys using non-standard instrumentation, and he was briefly a member of the Buggles, which I know because I am old. But somehow his music has never connected with me. I don't know why. I really don't. It should. And there are some occasional bits here and there in all of his films that get my attention, but 95% of his career is just background noise to me. In this particular case, it was all bombastic taiko drums and arabesque wailing over the top of synthestras. And yeah, I know it was a real orchestra, but it might as well have been a synthestra. That's my point. And it just didn't work. Or I should say for me personally, it didn't work. It reminded me very much of the kind of stuff Bear McCreary did 15 years ago on Battlestar Galactica on a shoestring budget. And that worked for me, but this, nope, didn't. Perhaps it's something wrong with me. I've been pretty damn sick for more than 3 years, and that can bring about some anhedonia, where you don't enjoy much of anything. Perhaps that's it. But I saw Blade Runner 2, Blade Jogger, before I got sick, and I actively disliked that movie. I liked this way better than that pointless waste of time, so it could be as simple as this. Whatever it is that the director is selling, I am clearly not its intended audience. Here, check this out, and I'll be back in a second to wrap up. Welcome to my messy office where we are shilling my book, The Bones of an Angel, with cover art by Paula Tabor. You can buy it on Amazon for $1 in Kindle or more than $1 in Dead Tree format. Here's a review from Wayne Conrad, 5 out of 5 stars. Have you ever had a hunger for something special, like a very good bar of chocolate, so you buy it, and you tell yourself that this time you're going to savor it and eat just so much a day? Then, an hour later, there's no chocolate left. And although you are much too grown up and too neat to have chocolate smeared all over your face and your hands, you feel just like someone who does have chocolate smeared all over their faces and hands. That's this book, chocolatey and delicious. One thing I enjoy about Randall Shanz's writing is that he is neither anxious to break with the past, nor does he slavishly imitate it. An example of this is the story Curse the Darkness. This story is written in a rollicking 1950s, 60s style. It occurs in space. There's actions, bad guys, and heroes that do clever things to save the day. Science even plays a major role in the story. Science in science fiction. Imagine. This makes for fun reading. If that's all the story was, it would be guilty of just imitating the past. But the story takes place in a rich, believable future where India is a major space power, and where one of the good guys is Zoroastrian, and where religion is treated respectfully and with clear eyes. Kevin is neither rehashing the past nor throwing it away, but building his own thing upon it. That's what Kevin does, story after story. He keeps calling me Kevin. It's actually Randall Sean's. I used to write under a pseudonym. This is an old review. I apologize. Sean's writing style, I corrected that myself. Sean's writing style is clear and plain. It stays in the background and lets the substance of the story take the spotlight. By plain, I don't mean amateurish. Sean's knows how to construct a sentence, but he's not afraid to send you to the dictionary to look up a word you haven't seen before. But neither does he use fancy words to show off. It just happens to be the best way to express the story. Thank you. Please check it out at the link below. I really appreciate your time. And we're back. Welcome to what I hope is the more interesting part of this review, where I ruminate about adaptational fidelity. There's two ways to adapt a book into a movie. Either you take it as literally and faithfully as possible, or you distill it down to the parts that you think are most important and tell a streamlined version of the story that diverges significantly from the source text. There's good and bad aspects to both approaches. We have all dragged friends to a movie, then caught their annoyed stares afterwards and said, "Hey, it was better in the book." At the same time, we've all seen word-for-word adaptations that are just tedious. On balance, though, I tend to favor taking some liberties. A movie is not a book, and a book is not a movie. They are very different formats, with different conventions and limitations. So it's best, I think, to just jump into that, own it, be true to the parts that you absolutely have to be true. You still need to tell the story, of course, but you can approach the way you tell the story from virtually any angle. And the movie medium as a whole favors a somewhat less literal approach. If your movie feels like a documentary about the book rather than telling the story of the book, then you did it wrong, I think. Bearing in mind that I'm a nobody whose opinion doesn't matter. Back in the 1970s, world-famous lunatic Alejandro Jodorowsky attempted to turn Dune into a movie. This was a super crazy no-way project that no sane person would attempt, but it's not surprising that it fell apart. Hell, it starred Orson Welles as Baron Harkonnen, and as everyone knows, Orson had been working under a voodoo curse since 1942. No, I am not even joking about that. The moment he's involved, problems arise, which is a shame because, damn, I love Orson Welles. Mick Jagger was going to play Fade, Salvador Dali was going to play what would certainly have been an exasperatingly hilarious nuts version of the Emperor, Pink Floyd was going to do the soundtrack. There's a full documentary on this that's worth watching. Did I mention that it was going to be 10 hours long? Because it was going to be 10 hours long. Nuts, right? Now, when I was young, the failed Jodorowsky Dune was one of those what-if kinds of things that we were all fascinated by, and understandably a bit frightened of, which you'd understand if you've ever seen any of his other films, and if you have not seen any of his other films, you absolutely positively should not. Anyway, then the Lynch film came out, and it was just awful. Just awful. Bear in mind that I think it's awful because I'm going to say nice things about it later, but the important part here is for you to remember that it's awful. Anyway, after Lynch's Dune failed, people got more interested in the failed Jodorowsky version, even though compared to the Lynch version, it was completely unhinged. There was also a cheap but pretty good TV version from about 20 years ago that everybody seems to have forgotten. Now, when Denis Villeneuve's version was announced, it was interesting to see how the public reacted. One group instantly self-segregated themselves and started shitting on not only the Lynch version, which is understandable, but also making fun of the abortive Jodorowsky version, which makes less sense, firstly because, it doesn't exist, but secondly because these people without fail seem to have been in the absolute adaptational fidelity camp. What is on the page must be on the screen, and no exceptions. And to my limited knowledge, that is the least interesting way to do anything. These people started lying and misrepresenting Jodorowsky's project, which, again, is really weird because the real information is readily available, and also because the reality of it is way weirder than any of their lies. But these people only want to tear down the heretics. There is a certain class of people who just can't enjoy something without ruining something else. And yeah, that's fun, but it's a little like bubblegum. It tastes good, but you can't live off of it. And if you try, you're going to starve to death with a full belly. And it's worth noting that most of these people seem to have forgotten the TV miniseries version exists, which is the only reason they're not ragging on that. Isn't it better to praise something for being good than to praise mediocrity for simply not being terrible? Jodorowsky's opinion, and I suspect Lynch's as well, but I don't know, is that the book is the book is the book. The movie is not going to change the book at all. The book will always be there. It is the job of a filmmaker to bring as much of the story as possible to the screen within the limitations of the format. And how they go about this is really up to them. You can do a burger and fries adaptation of a Stephen King novel, or you can do The Shining, which is one of the few genuinely scary films ever made. And yet it takes a hell of a lot of liberties with the book. Now, if you don't like the movie, that's fine. Stephen King doesn't like the movie. But the book is still there for you unchanged. And the movie, while not the book, is its own distinctive thing, which has to be taken on its own merits or lack thereof. Think of it like a Waffle House cook versus a cook in a Thai restaurant. You have both the same ingredients, and the Waffle House guy will make something straightforward, and the Thai guy will give you something very different. Which you like better is entirely a matter of personal taste, and bear in mind that I don't like fancy or weird food most of the time. But if I can choose only one, I will probably choose the Thai thing because it'll at least be interesting. I might hate it and wish I'd gone for the Waffle House thing, but the potential rewards with Waffle House are less than the potential rewards of the more experimental Thai take on the same dish. I might hate it, but it might be great, whereas the Waffle House thing will be no better than I expect. Incidentally, a friend of mine bet me that I couldn't use Waffle House 10 times in a paragraph, and he was right. I've only got 5 here, and I don't want to belabor the joke. What that means is that I don't get a free lunch from Waffle House, which was the wager, which is pain in my ass because I love Waffle House. Damn it. Anyway, as I said above, David Lynch's Dune sucks. I will give it this though, it is distinctive. Love it or hate it, you will not confuse it with any other film. It exists in its own sub-genre consisting of exactly one film. It is the Tully monster of big-budget science fiction films, and while it fails in an interesting way that no one else would have tried, and yet one that is completely different from the way in which Jodorowsky would have failed. Lynch, who by the way hates his own film, did bring his own artistic vision to it, and really that's what you're paying the guy to do, you know? The book is the book is the book, and the movie is his personal take on the book, the parts that resonate with him, and how he thinks it's best to tell it. Now, I take a lot of exception with the way that he chose to do it, but there are some laudable aspects. For instance, I love the fact that he decided to take this fairly standard Chosen One overthrows the evil empire single-handedly storyline and tells it as an art film rather than as a straight-ahead drama or an action art. That's a gutsy move. I love the opulence of the set design and the costuming, and he rightly understood that for a story this big, you need actors that are at least as big as the story they're in. Jürgen Prochnow, Patrick Stewart, Max von Sydow, Jose Ferrer, Dean Stockwell, Linda Hunt, Sting. Come on, son, that's a one-in-a-lifetime cast. The new movie can't hold a candle to that. They're not bad, mind you, but they don't have the inherent presence of the cast of Lynch's film. So while it is an unquestionably bad film, it is also the case of a director taking an epic but philosophical story and trying to tell it in an artistic, ambiguous, and philosophical way. Sure, it was way too big of a horse for him to ride, but in the end, metaphorically speaking, you have to stay on the bull for 8 seconds to win, right? If you fall off in 1 second or 7, that doesn't mean you're any less brave than the guy who stays on for the full 8. It just means that you probably kind of suck. But you're still pretty brave, and that deserves some respect. Which is where, for me, intellectually, the 2021 version of Dune doesn't work. It takes no chances. It is a very straightforward attack on the story. It goes from A to B to C in plodding, predictable fashion. It is literal. What is on the page is on the screen, and if that's all you're interested in, well, I don't know why that's all you'd be interested in when you could just go read the book for the nth time. But for me, when I go to see a movie adaptation, I'm looking forward to seeing the book filtered through someone else's perspectives. With the shitty 1984 version, I got that. With this one, I don't feel like I did. It just felt bland and sterile and curiously vacant. Final word, Jodorowsky spent several years working on Dune and failed. When he heard Lynch's version was coming out, he was devastated. He was scared. Lynch was, after all, another artsy director taking a stab at something that was very precious to Jodorowsky's heart, and which ended up breaking his heart when it failed. His biggest fear was that it might be good. If the Lynch's version was good, then it kind of invalidated Jodorowsky's own vision, right? If he made it work and I couldn't, then that means that I suck and his version might be even better than mine and more valid. That's not what Jodorowsky sounds like, I just can't do his accent. Anyway, he was eventually dragged to it against his will, and he was overjoyed that it sucked. Not because he's malicious, but simply because it was a relief to know that his own vision was still valid, even if it would never be realized. I'm not sure I conveyed that well, but hopefully you get what I mean. When asked about the 2021 movie, Jodorowsky said that Given the way the modern film industry works and the scale and the expense of these projects, he felt that it would be a bland product and take no risks, and be the kind of easily digestible tripe that anyone could make, a burger and fries rather than amazing beef and tom kha gai soup. He didn't wish it any ill will, he just thinks that it'll be bland and sterile and passionless, which, in my opinion, it was. If you disagree, and I am sure that most of you will, please feel free to call me a dickweed in the notes below. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and if you'd like to like, subscribe, and share, please do. And if you don't, that's cool too. I won't hold it against you. Again, thank you very much for your time and kind attention. Now, go the hell away.